Hello and welcome to another episode of the Breachside Broadcast, home of the finest voxcasting either side of the breach. On today's episode, we begin another epic tale. The denizens of Malifaux are dealing with the cataclysmic changes wrought by the Burning Man. The balance of power is shifting. Old factions are transforming, and new cults are entering the mix. I hope you enjoy part 1 of Madness of Malifaux, right after this word from our sponsor.
This episode of the Breachside Broadcast is brought to you by Crazy Sam's Safe Houses. Need somewhere to lay low for a while? Crazy Sam will set you up in a nice, anonymous row house in a quiet neighbourhood while it all blows over. Each of Sam's properties includes excellent places to hide with multiple routes of egress, heavy curtains and peepholes in all the doors. Ask about our discount for repeat customers. Cleaning fees apply.
Madness of Malifaux by Tim Akers and Matthew Majorican. High above Malifaux, a man burned. His arrival was a glorious calamity, a rupture of the barriers between time and space. The sound of roaring fire boomed and echoed day and night, a relentless cataclysm of flame. Cauterized strands of burning light ran across the sky like the pale tendrils of scar tissue, turning the air hot and raining ash and molten light onto the charred rooftops of the city below. In the moment after he ripped apart the weave, something flashed through these two minds sharing one body. It was so short-lived to have almost never have existed at all, but fate allowed the burning man to recognize one thing before being consumed once more in the fires of confusion and eternal pain that racked his body. He was home. For months, churning black clouds blanketed the skies, shot through with skeins of flame that burned without fuel. Day and night disappeared into an eternal dusk, lit only by flames and the fever dreams of the mad. There was no respite from the heat, the darkness, or the howling screams of the broken. The burning man's bright star pierced the sky like a wound bleeding light and madness. But how beautiful it was! How it called! Some saw patterns in the fiery colors, where realities clashed and broke apart. The burning man's grip melted their realities like candle wax, squeezing out logic and reason until only a dry husk remained. Flame caught these hollow shells. It spread. Cults whispered in shadowed alleyways and proclaimed destruction in the streets. Portals opened without rhyme or reason, vomiting monstrosities and rivers of flame. The cult of the burning man rose and consumed. There was nowhere to hide from the burning man's corrupting touch. This living blight in the sky disappeared on occasion, shunting to earth for hours or days, before returning to his place in Malifaux's new constellations. These brief respites brought only greater tension and fear, as the citizens of Malifaux scuttled through the fallen ash, glancing at the sky and praying the apparition wouldn't return. But he always did, bringing new madness and new destruction. Until now. Weeks have passed without the burning man's presence. The skies are dark. Snow falls instead of ash. Cultists still roam the streets, but their mad babbling is easier to ignore. In the halls of power and the back rooms of the true power, plans are made and schemes are laid. Even among the common folk, hope begins to bloom. The burning man does not realize what he is, or what his presence does. Only one thing lingers like smoke in his mindscape. Until his work is done, he must, return. Malifaux must burn. The crown room was in ruins. Scorch marks on the floor framed the spot where Marlow's great desk once stood. The shelves and boxes of records, tracing every contract, every connection, every broken promise of the guild. All of it had been turned to ash in a heartbeat. Mahogany banisters from Italy and redwood chairs from America both looked the same after the Burning Man's arrival. It was impossible to tell Jango Roux ware apart from ornate French ceramics. Work from the finest artisans were worth more as paperweights, for all the beauty their melted blobby forms now presented. Marlow found it fitting. The treasures were just like Malifaux. Neither could be restored in a day. It was the reason he'd been sent to this cursed place, to cull the guild's excesses, the ceaseless ignorance to their problems, and bring Malifaux to its fullest potential. Marlow had no doubt it could still be done, but the situation was frustrating. Marlow looked up from his impromptu office space, really just a solid desk and chair borrowed from the Enclave. The Crown Room's ruined northern wall opened before him, giving a full view of the Iron Ram's tracks. If he squinted, Marlow could just see the shimmering edges of the Great Breach. The sky was worryingly clear, as it had been for weeks. A cool breeze rustled papers on Marlow's desk. He wasn't used to things being so calm. "Where are you?" the Governor-General whispered to himself. He could almost see a shadow where the Burning Man would have been. There was a knock on the door. The makeshift panel of cheap pine rattled in its frame. Marlow checked his new watch, a Frodsham make. Right on time. "Come in," he called. A line of aides filtered in. Marlow was pleased to see them looking well kept and resolute despite their surroundings. High Treasurer Monastus and Collins were with the group. They formed a semicircle around Marlow's desk and began their reports. "I apologize about the time it's taken to get the mansion up and running again, sir," Monastus said, speaking quickly. "We're pressed for enchanters to finish etching the gloss, but we're making good headway. If the receipts are anything to go by. Plaster, molding, painting." Marlow chuckled dryly. "A little breeze never hurt anyone, Monastus. I'm more focused on Earthside. Are their shipments still on schedule?" "Yes, sir," Monastus said, shuffling his papers. "We've had some problems moving material from Vienna to Santa Fe, given the aquatic interference in the Atlantic and recent hostilities in Africa, and a good deal of our focus has been shifting to the South Asia Sea. Troubling reports in that area. Regardless, Mr. Tull and his company are due to arrive later today. The King's Empire has been quick to provide assistance." "Good. Tell Hoffman I'll meet our new arrivals at the station. Keep Vienna informed on what's going on. They need to understand we still need Earthside assets to keep things moving here," Marlow said. "Anything else?" "Something is happening in Japan," Collins answered, presenting a sheaf of new reports. "Our agents are still trying to suss out the details." "Leave them here. I'll go over them later. We've got our share of troubles, but I don't want anything unexpected disrupting our supplies from Earth." Marlow leaned back in the rickety chair that had replaced his grand seat. "That will be all, Monastus. Collins, give me a moment." The treasurer bowed before taking his leave with his aides in tow. Collins sat gingerly into an empty chair that looked like it might collapse at any moment. He had to move a copy of the Tatler from the arm of the chair. He gave it a brief scan and grimaced. "Have you been reading this?" Collins asked. "The Tatler? No. Why?" "It's like they fired their copy editor. Look at this." Collins spread the front page and stabbed it with one finger. "Beautiful and bright 3 times in one paragraph. They're not even trying." "I'm sure you could write a letter to the editor, if it concerns you so much. Nellie has free rein over there, as long as she doesn't say anything critical of the guild. We have more important matters. I trust you've gotten a look at some of these reports?" Marlow asked. Collins folded the Tatler and tossed it aside. A few, sir. Mostly the ones relating to the Guard and our deployment strategies. And what are your thoughts? Collins raised his brows, settling into his explanation like a professor expounding on his favorite subject. All things considered, sir, it's going well. Cornelius Bass is handling the Badlands. He's already captured several convicts. Not Barrows, but I'm confident that will happen in time. The Guard is dealing with cult activity and general unrest, but things have died down since the Burning Man's last appearance. The only issue I see is Karis. She's definitely more of a problem than she was before, rallying the crazies who have started worshipping the Burning Man over the past few months, and attacking our vulnerable spots. The Governor General mulled over Collins' words. The aide was being honest, if sugarcoating things a bit. He hadn't mentioned the sightings of that woman with the lantern and her people in the quarantine zone, or the fact that the guild was being overrun by propaganda and rag sheets spouting the Burning Man's manifesto. There were other things Collins didn't know about, of course. Anonymous tips pointed to Justice and her marshals going off the books for personal missions. The secretary's absence also wormed in the back of Marlow's head. It wasn't like Lucius not to ingrain himself in drama and chaos, but the last few months had seen the masked man and his lawyers give up their usual spotlight. Marlow finally spoke. I agree. We're trying to do too much with too little. The departments have been handling things well, but they can't keep going at this rate. It's good that Vienna finally got the message. The Governor General glanced at the empty train tracks. Let's just hope this Tull fellow is as impressive as he's supposed to be. Collins broke into a half smile. That's why you've been working here, I take it. One of the reasons. The trains aren't running on schedule, and I want to be the first person who knows when they're coming in. That whole group is... Marlow fumbled for the right word. They're notorious. Definitely made names for themselves back on Earth. But that's for me to worry about. I'm sure the conductors will get things back on schedule soon enough. In the meantime, Collins made to get up. He was interrupted by a distant shrill whistle. Both men raised their brows and looked down the tracks. A plume of smoke rose above the ruined walls of the station, chugging closer. The sound of the iron ram followed close after, and the great engine hove into view with dozens of heavily laden transport cars behind, the great breacher's energies slipping off them as they completed the journey from Earth. The engine labored under the weight of the tarp-covered carriages and flatbeds. Speak of the devil, Marlow muttered to himself, looking at the dented watch sitting at the corner of his temporary desk. The broken hand still read 5:47. Seems we're due at the Enclave. The Governor General stood and grabbed his coat, before slipping the watch into his left pocket. The new files found their way inside the desk, to be dealt with later. It was time to meet the Guild's latest reinforcements. It had been days since Shenlong had waded into the meditative springs near Promise. Yet his body showed no signs of weakness. The monk stepped from the waters, each footstep planted firmly on the ground. Deep, deep within his soul, the wounded dragon stirred. It was scared. The Burning Man's false sunrise would be here soon. Shenlong enjoyed the warm air on his bare skin, watching the horizon. The dragon would learn the strongest prisons were not gods or magic, but human will. An empty man moved through the crowd. He wore a half cloak with the hood pulled close to his face. Beneath the cloak, his clothes were finely tailored, out of place with the tattered bandages that wrapped his wrists and hung loose over his hands. A bundle wrapped in burlap lay slung over one shoulder. It was not unusual for a man to go armed in this part of Malifaux, but the empty man did not wish to draw attention, and the sword on his shoulder would have drawn all sorts of the wrong attention. The blade whispered to him, speaking to the runes cut into his back and branded in his bones. He laid a flame-scarred hand against the hilt. Silence, friend. I hear her. He shifted his head, and the hood slid back. A deep scar circumscribed his skull, nearly hidden beneath the ugly red burns that left him bald. His face was a jigsaw of broken flesh and deep crescent scars, partially obscured by the goggles over his eyes. The passers-by grimaced at his appearance. It gave him a wide berth. All but one. She fell in step beside him. Colette Du Bois wore a modest fitted jacket that accentuated her waistline and bosom, and a grey blouse beneath that. Deep navy trim accentuated the olive-coloured dress and hat. It was a perfect combination of colours that wouldn't leave any impressions. The attempt at subterfuge was spoiled by peacock feathers poking out from one of the rising hems. She carried an elegant leather-clad valise, with brass fittings in her gloved hands, probably lined in lead. "I didn't expect to see a magpie in Malifaux." Her voice was soft, with a teasing, threatening edge honed by years of practice. The empty man nodded in her direction. "The flames have flushed all sorts of wildlife. Your note requested that we meet 3 blocks from here," he said. "Did you think to surprise me, Miss Du Bois?" "Is that even possible?" she asked. Her eyes went to the bundle on his shoulder, and she suppressed a shiver. "It is not." He turned to face her. "Does my appearance disturb you?" "I've seen worse," she answered with a sniff. "Besides, you can't blame a girl for being careful, Mr. Ravencroft." Colette raised an eyebrow as she casually took Damian's arm. As her skin brushed against the puckered runes on his forearm, she caught her breath and nearly stumbled. She froze for a second, as if adjusting to diving into ice water, before recovering. He was impressed at her poise, if not her perfume. "These are interesting times. I'm sure you know many people who would love to see a magpie and a dove have their wings clipped." Damian sneered at the nickname. She was trying to get under his skin. "We have business, Miss Du Bois," he said, turning his attention to the street. The sword on his back was becoming insistent. "Do you have the volume we discussed?" "Of course." Colette handed over the valise. It was heavier than he expected. The smuggler continued. "A full copy of the Flamme, as promised. The original owner is babbling to himself in a locked cellar. I'm sure I don't need to tell you about what reading that thing does to people." Damian tucked the valise into a satchel under his cloak, then retrieved an envelope thick with script. "Lesser minds, perhaps. The benefits of my sabbatical in the Yellow Crypt should negate any hostile magic in that text." "It's your sanity, Mr. Ravencroft." "The remainder of your payment, Miss Du Bois. Your services are appreciated," Damian said, handing the envelope to Colette. She gave a quick look before slipping it inside her dress, satisfied. "It has been a pleasure, Mr. Ravencroft," the smuggler replied, putting on her infamous smile. "I've heard so many stories about you, I was beginning to think you were nothing more than a legend. But I should be going. The girls and I have a few more errands to run today. Say what you will about the Burning Man, but he's done wonders for business." Colette dropped Damian's arm. As the dampening effect from Damian's runes released her, a shudder ran through Colette's body. Damian cast his eye down to the street, hands loose at his waist. Before she could disappear into the crowd, Damian cleared his throat. "One more thing before you go. I was asked to deliver something to you. I believe it is from our mutual friend." Damian held out a folded letter, sealed with wax. The paper hung between the two for a moment. Colette's expression flickered between curiosity and caution. The performer eventually plucked the letter with a gloved hand and cracked it open. Damian watched her face while she read, looking for some reaction. "Well," Colette said a moment after she'd finished, "I'm surprised he's alive." She gave a joyless laugh, folding the letter and slipping into her sleeve. "I knew if he was, that old man would figure out a way to still make everyone's life miserable." She hesitated for a second, weighing her next words. They came out smooth and perfect, almost naively sweet. "He put you in charge of his affairs in Malifaux, then?" "Absolutely not," Damian said. "Our interests aligned several times over the years, and he occasionally came to me with problems that he couldn't solve. But But if Victor thinks I'm in any way under his service, he's sorely mistaken. I am my own man." Colette pursed her lips while she thought. When she spoke, her voice had a timbre of worry to it. "This isn't good. I'm sure you aren't the only one he sent messages to." "Perhaps. Depends on how much stationery they allow him in prisons," Damian said dryly. His eyes were down the street, where a pair of street toughs were lounging outside a tavern. Lookouts, perhaps, or just vagrants. He turned his attention back to Colette. "Pieces are still falling into place. We have each pursued our own agendas in his absence, but Malifaux is a dangerous place, for doves as well as for magpies." "What are you saying, Mr. Ravencroft?" "Perhaps it is time our interests align as well. Chaos is a gift to those wise enough to take advantage, and the Burning Man is nothing if not chaotic." Colette cocked her head up, watching him down the length of her aquiline nose. After a moment's consideration, she twitched her lips into something that nearly resembled a genuine smile. "The understatement of the year. Very well. If our interests align, I will reach out." She nodded again, then disappeared into the crowd. The sword on Damian's back rumbled angrily, like a dog without a bone. "Patience, old friend." Damian pulled his half-cloak back over his head, furrowing his brow. His skin wrinkled around the deep scars of his flesh. "Sometimes we have to make friends." With Colette gone, the crowds closed around him once again. Odd characters were not unusual this close to the quarantine zone, and his half-cloak and burlap bundle didn't draw much attention. He was anxious to get home and delve into the Flamme, to discover the magic that was driving so many reasonable people out of their minds. That the Burning Man's influence had corrupted as sharp a mind as Maxine Agassiz's unsettled Damian. But he was confident the effects of the Yellow Crypt would protect him from the tome's influence. Hopefully. And if not... "So, what's in the pack, old man?" The voice came from behind him. Lost in his thoughts, Damian hadn't noticed the crowds thin and the shadows grow. He paused now, looking around curiously. The pair of street toughs from earlier were closing, backed up by a handful of rabble, sporting saps and broken pipes. Damian smiled. "In my pack? I assure you nothing that would be of interest to the likes of you." "Reckon we'll be judging that," the first tough said. He circled around in front of Damian, thumping his club in the palm of his hand. "Hand it over, and no one gets hurt." New sorts of interaction always confuse me. Do they hand you a script at birth or something? Damian shrugged his cloak off, letting it fall to his feet. To their credit, the toughs didn't run at the first sight of his scars. Too bad. "Let's try again. You don't want anything I'm carrying. Are we clear?" The two toughs gave each other a disbelieving look. "And I said we'd be the judge of..." "That's enough of that." Damian swung Die Thou Unsung from his shoulder, letting the burlap slip free of the blade. The broken sword crawled with iridescent runes, matched by the brands burned into Damian's forearms. The tough dropped his club and ran. His friends followed a step behind. Damian let out a long and impatient sigh. Slowly he rewrapped the blade and went on his way. Damian took a circuitous route back to home, diving deep into the industrial zone before circling back into the quarantine. His destination was a door, hidden away under a plain, grimy building. A small set of steps gave access to a basement apartment. Damian pulled out a key, inserted it into the lock, and turned. Damian gave one final look before slipping inside. The door closed without a sound. The basement was suitable for a small family, designed to be extraordinarily typical. A single room, sparsely furnished with a table and 3 matching chairs. A cabinet proudly displayed a selection of knockoff porcelain. A cot and a few articles of clothing completed the look. Stove, pots, pans, and a modest pantry. He had to come in here every couple of weeks to dust and move some of the furniture around to give it the impression of occupancy. What good was a disguise if he didn't bother to keep it up? Close observation of a wall near the cabinet would reveal a tiny line running parallel to the peeling wallpaper. Beneath were a variety of keyholes and panels. Trying to open the door by force or inserting a key into any of the presented locks would result in a deadly bit of arcane backlash. Safe entry required opening a second hidden plate and using a complex skeleton key, of which there were less than a handful of copies. Damian extended a scarred hand. Witch Hunter runes burned into his flesh greedily consumed the magical energy worked into the booby-trapped lock. When they finished, Damian inserted a plain key into the now inert door. Internal mechanisms clicked, and it swung open on silent hinges. The scholar walked inside, sealing the entrance behind him with a heavy thud. The room beyond was messier, but more homey, at least by Damian's standards. Treasures and bric-a-brac shone from makeshift shelves. Chess sets, all of which were mid-game, decorated other surfaces. Dozens of curios each had their own place as part of Damian's ongoing quest to catalogue and solve the unknown. The safe house's size did allow for some elements of comfort, but most of the space was dedicated to work. The endless work. A makeshift parlor with stuffed chairs, lounges and carpets, spread out from under a giant arachnoid construct dangling from the ceiling. Candle holders mixed with electric lights, rewired from the former mechanical inhabitants of the safe house. It wasn't exactly like his former studies, but Damian adapted. An improvement from the yellow crypt cells, at least. Damian was far from alone in this place. People came and went on a regular basis. One permanent resident rested on a couch, her feet on an ottoman. She wore a death-head skull painted on her face, but her grim face was pinched and beatific concentration. A blade was resting next to her on a cushion, with an aviator jacket thrown over the hilt. She was tinkering with her enchanted pistol and didn't look up when Damian entered. "You could be dead right now, Belle," he said. "I knew it was you." The woman tapped her sword. Damian felt the link between himself and the blade vibrate faintly. A cauterizing mark meant to ensure a handler never lost track of a witchling under her charge. Even after escaping the Yellow Crypt, Sonia Crid's brands proved impossible to remove. Gods know he had tried. Damian took off his cloak and hung it on a hook by the door, then dropped his satchel on the floor. True, but what if I wasn't alone? An old argument, oft repeated. You're always alone. Besides, I can protect myself. Belle looked up, setting her pistol down on the table. She uncrossed her legs and stood, her forehead creasing in curiosity, as Damian produced the valise from his satchel. Colette delivered. Surprisingly. I assumed Ramo still had her smuggling, but that's no longer the case. She sends her love, by the way. Damian felt the edges of the lead-lined case. His scars tingled, desperate to absorb the magic inside. I wish you'd let someone else do those errands. Every time you go out, you risk getting caught, Belle said. We run enough risks in this place. True, but we're in the midst of a storm. Information about potential allies doesn't concern anyone but you or me. I won't risk our collective being discovered because Leger can't keep his mouth shut. He's around here somewhere. Marco, too, Belle chuckled. When they heard what you were bringing in, they made themselves scarce. Did the other Arcanists know about this thing? They have their own troubles. Anastasia Caris has been completely swept up by the delusions of the Burning Man. Elijah Borgman and his followers treat her like a champion. A champion of candles burning at both ends. She makes her move too early, but I'm curious as to how it will play out. Sandeep Desai and Charles Hoffman are both afraid of knowing, afraid to use what's in front of them for some greater purpose. Which one would break first? Belle's question was prompt. Damian contemplated. Mr. Hoffman. He's already aware of Ramos' knowledge, and he's picked up more from deactivating these. Damian gestured to the enormous arachnid above Bell with his brows. Always another one to turn off, and another bit of information added to Hoffman's own designs. Mr. Desai, on the other hand, something haunts him. My contact was close-lipped, but says the man failed one of his apprentices. The Winter Witch was somehow involved. Can you imagine? I'm curious to know more. A few of Mr. Desai's students mentioned the name Lohith, but that doesn't mean anything to me. Yes. And to think there was a time when I would have done anything to hear even one of those things you just said, Bell mused. How's the Union? She arched an eyebrow when Damian waved the question away. Tony Ironsides is inexperienced, but she sees what's important. She can't rally the people like Ramos could, but there's potential. At the moment she's too public a figure to be of much use, but I'm intrigued by how she'll play the long game. Now, he concluded, let's tend to the present matter. Damian felt excitement rising in his chest. He pulled his quartz lens goggles over his eyes. You can step back if you'd like, he said to Bell, slipping a pair of leather gloves over his hands. Bell didn't need to be told twice. She put on her own protective gear and retreated several feet. Damian felt the wards etched into his skin flare to life when he opened the case. The rush of magic was nearly painful, like standing in the sun for too long on a hot day. A ream of papers lay inside. Words scribbled in black ink covered every page. Plumes of magic were visible through the goggles. Bruised violets and incandescent reds, all bound together with lines of orange and yellow. Even the witch hunter mark struggled to contain every wisp of the madness, practically flowing from the pages. Eventually the colors faded significantly. Damian traced over the words, mostly pseudo-spiritual drivel, false correlations, crazed scribblings. A few crude illustrations filed past as Damian leafed through the pages. Belle leaned forward as far as she dared. Are you sure it's a good idea to keep something like that around? Those words change people, and you don't know if you're fully immune to its influence or just resistant to it. I don't want to wake up one day and have to, She ran a thumb across her throat. A muscle in Damian's cheek twitched. It won't come to that. You know what Crid's wards are capable of. If you do find me blathering on about the Burning Man and encouraging this insufferable chaos we've all dealt with these past months, I give you full permission to put that sword to good use. You blathering on? Even if you did get corrupted, I'm not sure I could tell the difference. Clever girl, Damian said, then slammed the valise shut. I'll need time for further analysis. Everything is random with the Burning Man, especially at first blush. But the damn thing is random. He's just chaos. How can you understand what doesn't want to be understood? It was a question Damian had asked himself many times. There is always a pattern. Just because we can't see it doesn't mean it isn't there. Chaos is what people label something when it's too much for them to understand. The Burning Man can be predicted. Learning about him is possible. He is nothing but a puzzle waiting to be solved. Some just refuse to see him as more than impossible noise. But there have already been successes, proven successes. Dr. Maxine Agassiz, for one. Her approach was too scientific, too mathematical. Her formulas are good, but she's forgotten something critical. He is a force of nature as well as magic. Both can be understood, but not solely through scientific means. Silence fell over the pair. Damian's fingers steepled while he thought. Behind him, on one of the dozens of display shelves that held his life's treasures, a wooden puzzle box shifted and changed, different parts emerging from its surfaces in time with the man's racing mind. Bell glanced at the box. Damian once used it to preserve his mind from Crid's ministrations, and some fragment of him remained in it, even now. Well, if you can pull yourself out of your own head for a minute, a few more things came while you were out, Bell said. I put them in the study. Damian made a small noise of pleased surprise. The safe house had a number of smaller adjacent rooms. the largest of which looked to be a mishmash of every possible culture and style. Diagrams and notes lay on work tables, inventions and magical objects in various stages of completion, hung from the ceiling, lined shelves, and peeked out from cabinets. Tools and books created a well-kept library on one wall. Mismatched furniture huddled in the only other available corner. This was his study. It was small, but made Damian proud. Here, anyone could learn to develop their gifts without the fear of imprisonment or persecution. Attendees were few. Damian only sought out those with no more moves left to make. The Arcanists had countless other hideouts. This one supported Ravencroft's ideology of creating a democracy of the learned, seeing the knowledge of magic spread as far and wide as possible, shared out so that a pauper could know as much as a king. Damian entered, moving to a heavy safe that doubled as a chair. He unlocked the safe and placed a valise on one of the shelves, then closed the heavy door and spun it shut. There is still knowledge that must be protected for the sake of the student. The scholar's joints cracked when he rose. A small box of ebony wood, inlaid with mother of pearl, sat on a bench beside the safe. Beneath it, a narrow slip of paper. Leger's latest acquisition? Damian asked. He picked it up near the docks, in the possession of a mad raftsman. Leger said the man tried to use it as collateral in a card game. Belle hooked her thumbs into her belt and smiled. After he lost, the man tried to steal it back. A losing proposition, especially given Mr. Damian's skills. Damian sat down and turned the box around, looking for the clasp. Did he try to open it? We both thought that was better left for you, boss, Belle said. Damian nodded and bent his attention to his new trinket. The box was a work of art, really. Tiny carvings ran in recessed lines across the edges, helping dampen the magic contained inside. Opening the lid revealed a sphere made of a polished, iron-like material. Small lines of magic coalesced on its dark surface. These represented the atmospheres of magic, running across whatever the orb was. In this case, Malifaux. Curious. Pretty, Belle said. Pretty useless, you mean? This is a Torella, without a doubt. They're supposed to be able to visualize changes in atmospheric magic. Damian waved a hand close to the sphere's surface. The colors snuffed out like a smothered flame. When he withdrew his hand, the colors returned. I doubt the scholarship behind such claims, but I'll be curious to see what it does, should the Burning Man return. When he returns, you mean, Belle said. Never wish for bad weather, my dear, Damian said. He snapped the box closed and stood up. Was there anything else? A messenger left that at our usual drop box. Belle nodded to the slip of paper tucked beneath the box. Doesn't make any sense to me. Another threat? Or something more interesting? The note was light, made of rice paper, with no other markings on the outside. Inside, simple letters spelled out a time and location. Ah, definitely more interesting. Damian glanced at the clock on the wall. There was little time to prepare, but he couldn't miss this opportunity. He practically ran from the study. I have an unexpected appointment. Hold down the fort. If I'm not back by nightfall, take that note to your contacts in the Ten Thunders, and let them know they have a rat. He grabbed his satchel and refastened his half-cloak. The puzzle box pulsed and whirred in its stand, reconfiguring itself while Damian grabbed pens and whatever assorted curios he felt could be useful. If this is a double-cross, I want my revenge. Like hell. If this is dangerous, you know I'm going with you. Belle started gathering her things, slipping the enchanted pistol into its holster and throwing on her aviator jacket. Damian didn't object. Honestly, he'd feel safer with her along. He secured his broken sword, rewrapping it in the burlap. Belle finished her preparations and looked him up and down. What did it say? Where are we going? Some doors only open once, my dear, and I can't afford to miss this one.
That's it for another episode of the Breachside Broadcast. Join us next time for part 2 of Madness of Malifaux.